The landscape of Minbar is primarily heavy mineral deposits and mountainous regions, interspersed with vast plains and valleys. River canyons divide the major landmasses, but there is only one small ocean providing the planet's primary surface water source. Shallow subterranean water deposits sustain the majority of the plant life, while near-continuous rainstorms in some areas keep the slightly impermeable ground moist enough for surface vegetation to thrive. These conditions have been the normal state of Minbar's ecology for millions of years, shaping the evolution of the planet's races from pre-sentient life to the Minbari race. Life on Minbar evolved in the same way as most races, from single-celled organisms on the planet's waters. Its lack of substantial planetary oceans prevented aquatic life forms from becoming much more complicated than the Podia stage, before room issues formed some of these early creatures left the water and developed land survival mechanisms. This started with increasingly complex marine and insect life, eventually becoming dominated by simple reptilian life. Complex environmental issues prevented reptiles from reaching large enough sizes to overwhelm other forms of developing life, allowing mammalian creatures to evolve. In cooler temperate zones where fur and warm-bloodedness were advantageous, physiologies were better for sustaining life than scales and externally regulated body heat. The two types of creatures evolved side by side in different areas of Minbar, until an undocumented event shifted the balance towards mammals. These creatures took increasingly larger sections of territory, evolving predatory abilities to compete with the still extant reptiles. Over more than 1 million years, both species coexisted atavistically until the reptiles were overwhelmed by their rivals and slipped from dominance. At this time, there were 4 major subspecies of mammals. Rodentia were prevalent in the planet's sprawling forests. Herbivores of a herd animal variety roamed the plains, defending themselves from reptiles and other mammals. Through large size and defensive adaptations, canine predators became the dominant carnivores of Minbar, their hunger and ferocity the primary factor in the diminishing population of reptilian life. Lastly, a simian form of life competed with rodents and smaller reptiles in several different ecological zones on the planet. Eventually, over a long period of planetary time, one of the simian races developed a defensive adaptation along the same lines as the herbivore herds, an antlered crest for protection against damage to the skull. This allowed them to dominate the other simians to the point of driving all but the smallest of the subspecies into extinction. Continuous evolutionary pressures involving the predatory canines and the few remaining breeds of carnivorous reptiles pushed this simian species to develop social adaptations and eventual tool-using skills. The preponderance of antlers on creatures of Minbar is attributed to the heavy mineral content of every ecological niche on the planet. Dissolved forms of calcium and heavy elements are present in everything due to particulate matter, erosion and suspension in the hydrosphere. It was impossible for living creatures not to become exposed to quantities far beyond what would usually be considered trace amounts of these elements, resulting in most forms of life developing external bone growth as a way of displacing what they were taking in on a daily basis. This also explains adaptations like the crystalline scales of animals such as the Minbar ulust, a lizard still found in the warmest parts of equatorial Minbar. With the development of tool-using behavior and social units, this antlered simian species rose to eventual dominance as the preeminent race on the planet. All other forms of life on Minbar were subjugated into either animals to be domesticated or enemies to be driven off or avoided. The race's agility and adaptive use of their environment made this possible in every ecological zone on Minbar, leading to the race's spread to every corner of the planet. Over the course of hundreds of generations, the simian species gained complete control over their world. As is the fate of dominant species with no real challenge to their growth rate, the only true enemy that remained to check their numbers was their own kind. First, the environment was hostile enough, and the amount of area the race had to spread in was large enough that the race did not clash very often, but this changed as their numbers grew. An omnivorous diet also led to conflicts as multiple. Social groups often found themselves in competition for all the same food sources. Violent encounters with each other drove the many groups of these simians into isolated seclusion in whatever part of the planet they could find that would support them biologically. The need for more room beyond these needs led to the development of primitive shelter-building skills, enabling the antlered simians to adapt to climates ill-suited to their biology. In addition, some simian groups sought refuge in the many cavern systems created by water erosion of the lithosphere. These shelters, which could not provide food in large quantities, but it did offer excellent protection from the elements, also exerted evolutionary pressure on their antler crests to grow closer to the skull to permit them easier access to these caves. As the resources of the surface dwindled, with so many simians drawing from them, as well as the remaining predator and herbivore species, subterranean dwelling became more common until the majority of the simian. The race went underground to survive. New caverns had been discovered and, in some cases, the race used harder minerals to cut into softer ones, opening up additional tunnels. With the discovery of vast underground lakes filled with fish and other aquatic life forms, the food issues diminished rapidly and the simians began to multiply again. This state of affairs lasted for more than 500,000 solar years, with surface-dwelling simians giving way to the other races as they migrated below. The Minbari would likely still be a subterranean race were it not for a protracted period of geological instability that forced them back to the surface rather than face extinction due to earthquakes and magmatic flooding of their living areas. In a few generations, vast numbers of evolved simians escaped to the surface to find it much changed since their exodus. The planet's surface, free from the predation of simians, had become overgrown with unchecked life. The canine species had all but destroyed the large, slower-to-breed reptiles, and were now hunting the herd animals across the open plains and the rodents of the forest. These predator animals were now quite large and initially posed a dire threat to the simians, mainly as the latter had grown used to having no checks against their growth. The late development of these canine breeds and the difficult-to-climb nature of the trees of Minbar provided the evolutionary impetus for avians to enjoy a period of undisturbed development, resulting in several species of rodentia-eating predator birds, many of which took on bright colors from the minerals of their environment. For the first time, small groups of this race had a reason to band together. Mutual protection. This next era was one of constant struggle. The simians became tribal and by necessity nomadic, never remaining in one place long enough for their numbers to destroy their environment through overconsumption. The need to overcome the canine breeds of predators drove them from tool-using to weapon-using and spurred their physical development, which had suffered from their period underground. Those that could adapt survived, while those that could not become food for the lupin breeds dominating the canine race. This period of hunt or be hunted, adapt or the existence did much to shape the simian race into the Minbari of the present day. Among the race's adaptations was a complex social order, with those most capable of fighting becoming a separate A-group within each tribe is responsible for the survival of the entire tribe. These warriors were afforded a large percentage of the food and tribal resources as needed to continue a strong defense, while most of the rest were given to expectant mothers and the tribe's children. The development of true intelligence had begun in earnest during the race's seclusion below, but the struggle for survival on the surface honed the simians' simple but effective minds into something a great deal more sentient. By the time the predator species were brought back under control, the simian race had for the most part evolved into what would be considered the base form of the Minbari race as it is known today. Weapons, agility, and tactics had won out over teeth, claws, and animal cunning. Intellect and strength both had a part to play in the continued survival of the species. Social and mental evolution would take a great deal more time, but physically, the Minbari had emerged as the dominant force on their planet. Those animals that could not be domesticated for tribal use were culled back to acceptable levels, and more permanent shelters were built in the most geographically effective places. Plants that could not be found in abundance in some places were moved closer to these areas and cultivated. The first steps towards civilization had been taken. It was these initial struggles against the forces of evolution, in the forms of other predators and other environmental factors on their planet, that first brought the attention of a race is far distant from the Minbari homeworld. This race watched in quiet fascination as the primitive Minbari fashioned weapons, defended themselves, and created homes in the solid rock of their somewhat inhospitable world. This level of determination and will to survive attracted the other race, and as the Minbari grew, so too did this alien interest in their welfare. It was the construction of Konatai, the first Minbari city, that convinced this race that the people of Minbar were worth contacting. Konatai, relatively small by the standards the Minbari of today, was a marvel of civil engineering in that time, with multiple level buildings carved out of the softer rock around a vast field of mineral deposits and several shafts of geothermally heated crystals for heat. When Konatai was first built, more than 10,000 Minbari lived there in relative peace and safety. The outside race, known to the present galaxy as the Vorlons, approached the people of Minbar in Konatai openly, showing a form that they thought would be pleasing and convincing the Minbari to remain peaceful while they conversed. The Vorlons were interested in this crested humanoid race for reasons of their own, not the least of which was as a developing species with the obvious potential to someday achieve great things, both on their own world and in the universe. The Vorlons discussed this and more during that first encounter, an event that historical records claim that it took 3 days without rest or food for anyone involved. Every trace of this meeting has now been erased from Minbari history for reasons that will become evident in later passages, but initially, the Minbari accepted the Vorlons eagerly. Indeed, the Minbari were respectful to the point of reverent to the Vorlons. From this dialogue came a tentative agreement between the races to remain open and accepting of each other, an agreement that still survives into modern times. The Vorlons also agreed to lend support when needed for the Minbari race to thrive on their world, especially within the city of Konatai. With the Vorlons' aid, the city was significantly expanded, encompassing an entire valley and the mineral mountains bordering it on 3 sides. This larger city became the refuge of hundreds of thousands of Minbari, all of whom began to worship the Vorlons as gods for their wisdom and great technology. The Vorlons would have reason to regret their open exchange of information and offer of aid later, but for the first few hundred years, they existed harmoniously with the Minbari. Wise enough not to give the Minbari too much too soon, the Vorlons paced the lesser race, giving them only what they exhibited a readiness to accept and use. To the Vorlons, this was a grand experiment. To the Minbari, this interaction became the stuff of religious legend. To protect the Minbari from learning the truth about them, the Vorlons played up this belief and gave it credence by ensuring that their forms matched the tiny preconceived notions the Minbari had about their gods were concerned. In these guises, the Vorlons both took advantage of and helped to share the Minbari religion. Their angelic forms were considered the holiest of forms, and the identities of the Vorlons in question became synonymous with the names of the Minbari's early gods. This era lasted 10,000 years and resulted in the deep integration of the Minbari gods with their culture. This enforcement of their beliefs formed lasting impressions in the Minbari concept of divinity, allowing the same theological beliefs to dominate their race throughout their cultural history. The Vorlons left their mark on the Minbari from the first moment they arrived on Minbar, a mark that would last for 30 millennia and guide the social development of their race through that entire time. Even while they walked among the Minbari, the Vorlons had a profound effect upon them. The presence of these opposed divinities allowed the Minbari living in Konatai to move swiftly past the normal stages of cultural and scientific development through the aid of the gods, while the Vorlons were careful to keep from advancing them too quickly. They were new to this intimate level of contact with another race and mistakes were made. They had intended from the start to make their gifts to the Minbari as an entire race. But their concentration in the city of Konatai precluded contact with other groups. For their part, the Konatai Minbari had little motivation to reach out to other tribes and offer their advantages. The Minbari were still warlike and territorial, which made the idea of sharing the benefits of those beyond the stars as alien to them as the Vorlons were. Over the generations that passed within the first 3,000 years of this era, Konatai's territory and sphere of influence grew disproportionately to their numbers because of this great strength. Other tribes were forced to either join with them or be considered enemies and driven from their lands. The Vorlons checked this behavior when they could, but it was in their own interests to ensure that this warrior spirit remain a part of the Minbari people. Other tribes thrived in this time period, though none did so as drastically as the Konatai people. A few received visits by one Vorlon or another as a separate contact from the main group Konatai. These tribes centered their existence around these luminous beings and were given advantages as befit the Vorlon in question. This led to several tribes of Minbari scattered across the planet with wildly uneven development levels. Some had effective ranged weaponry, while others were blessed with primitive transports. The strength provided by these Vorlon mentors led to dangerously violent conflicts when opposing tribes came into contact, but some tribes were spared these long battles through benefit of isolation or Vorlon interference, keeping them safe while they grew into their advantages. It was this latter behavior that marked the beginning of the end for this era. By 8000 DV, the face of Minbar was dominated by several major tribes, each one specialized as befit its experiences in the past. Those tribes that were constantly at war developed a martial tradition and become predominantly warriors, while those kept apart were more contemplative and religious. Other tribes, caught in the middle of the endless conflicts raging across the planet, became a third class of Minbari, enslaved by one tribe after another as common laborers. From this era forward, the foundations of the three castes had been laid.